So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Brent Patterson. He also lives in the Peterborough area and is active in Algonquin Park. Been with the MNR for a couple of decades, 25 years, I guess now. And he's a large animal research scientist, large mammal, sorry, research scientist. And he knows a good friend of ours, Ted Armstrong, who came from Thunder Bay, who grew up in the Markdale area. And Ted came and gave a talk on the caribou, the woodland caribou, about 10 years ago. And then, but but Brent has been here twice before, once at the library to talk about wolves and coyotes, probably coyote focus there. And then he came back when we were just settling into this place, and we had a full house pretty well. Again, with an update on the coyotes and wolves um, in Ontario and the work that he was doing with that. But this time when I invited him, he said, "Well, I'm working on this moose presentation. I'd really like to offer that if you'd be interested." And it's understanding the drivers of the population dynamics of moose in Ontario's boreal forests. So I was sort of looking at that tonight and thinking it'd be nice to hear that information, but also compare it to other boreal forests because we have Ontario's, but what about Newfoundland or I don't know that's or boreal, but certainly other places further west and maybe in Quebec as well. So that would be one of my questions after this presentation. So I invite you to welcome Brent Patterson. Thanks.
Yeah, good evening, and thanks for the introduction. Um, if you see me stop talking and start dancing, that's just can't resist. That's coming in through next door there. Um, yeah, so John gave a pretty good introduction there, actually. So I'm happy tonight to have the opportunity to talk to you about some research we've been doing on moose in Northern Ontario. But and I hope you'll agree that it's a pretty neat study. We've got a lot of elements, a lot of things going on, but we're he mentioned comparison with other boreal systems, and so we're very cognizant that we're only doing this work in one place. So what we're really trying to do is understand mechanisms and drivers, and it's not just getting numbers about what's happening, but it's understanding why it's happening. And then I think if we can get that kind of understanding, then it'll make it easier to apply these findings to other areas. So just sort of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through things. And I've got another caveat. The first few slides, the first few minutes, in fact, are going to be a bit dry because I have to set the stage and go through some of the background as to why we're doing this and sort of how we came up with the plan that we have. And then, but if you can stay away, I should have had them keep the curtains open until we get through that first part. But if you can bear with me through that first part, then I promise we'll get into some pretty interesting uh, findings and images and videos, and yeah, we're seeing some neat stuff that I'm happy to share. So as an outline, I just mentioned, I'll give you a bit of a background and context. I'll talk about what we're doing, give you some progress on what we found so far, and then end by talking about where things, where we're hoping to go with it down the road. So moose are an important resource for many Ontarians. It's an important subsistence food for our First Nations, and they're a valuable resource for sportsmen in the province and sportswomen. And they're also they have value beyond that, just in terms of being valued members of the ecosystem. And a lot of people enjoy just seeing and sort of interacting with moose in their own way, or just knowing that they're out there. So they're an important species on all sorts of different levels. Moose populations in Ontario generally declined in many parts of the province, starting around 2000, in that area, late 90s, early 2000s, and they declined on and off in most places for much of the next 15 years or more. And in the mid 2010s, there were some very substantial restrictions put in place on licensed harvest of moose by licensed hunters. And in many areas, despite quotas for hunters being dropped to near zero, moose populations didn't recover. They didn't come back. So that really posed a question of what's going on. Hunters often feel like they're taking the blame for things. And this is one case where clearly licensed hunting was not suppressing moose or keeping them down. So there was a real desire to try and understand what was happening there. I guess the other observation that I didn't mention here is that when the province collects or conducts their aerial assessments of moose in the wintertime, it's helicopter surveys. And the other thing that's assessed in addition to just moose numbers are calf numbers. So when we use the number of calves observed per 100 cows as an index of calf recruitment. And during this period of moose decline and low moose abundance in many areas, a key feature was that the number of calves seen during the winter surveys was also very low. So just before COVID, about a month before everything shut down, we held a workshop in Guelph, and we brought together researchers and managers from across Canada and from some American jurisdictions as well. And we spent a couple of days just talking about moose and moose research and trying to get a handle on what might be going on in Ontario and trying to get some advice about how best to sort of gain a better understanding of what's happening here. And at the end of the workshop, the participants recommended a three-phased approach. So they said, first, based on things that we talked about, it was obvious that Ontario has collected a lot of data on moose over the years. So I mentioned, every winter there's surveys conducted in a lot of places in the north. We have data from hunters, not just numbers of hunters, but what they take, but also data on how many wolves they saw while they were hunting, and data on how much effort they put forth, and so on, and data on changes in quotas over time. So the first recommendation was take all that data that you already have and see what it'll tell you. But do that with the understanding that you're probably going to need to do some sort of field study after that. And so that would be phase two, would be to conduct a field study to try and sort of serve as a fact-finding mission to really get a good handle on the state of things with regards to moose. And then the third phase, assuming that we learn something interesting in phase two, the third phase would be to try and move forward with some sort of adaptive management experiment where you take what you learned and then try and make some changes on the landscape and see if that changes the trajectory for moose populations. And those actions could be, could run the gamut. And I think that'll become a little bit more clear as I go through things of the different possibilities there. So we spent a couple of years analyzing the sort of existing data on moose, and we published a couple papers on that. And one of the sort of key findings was that what data we had suggested that we probably had a scenario during the 2000s and the 2010s where the combination of overharvest in some areas and predation, primarily by wolves, drove moose to fairly low numbers. And then once moose got down to those low numbers, removing just one of those factors was not enough to allow the population to grow. So and this is a common feature of many predator-prey systems, when something like a deer or a moose is very abundant, predators can't really do much to suppress that population, the growth of that population. But when you any sort of random events or any sort of combination of factors drives that population to low numbers, then even a fairly low level of offtake, whether it be from hunting or predation, is often enough to keep that population from ever sort of escaping that what we would refer to as a predator pit that it's sort of stuck in. Anyway, so the preliminary analysis that we conducted with the existing data sort of confirmed what we thought might be going on and suggested that, yeah, there's likely a combination of hunting and predation, and it pointed to the need to understand better how those two factors might interact, or how the landscape and other factors might interact to sort of make those things stronger or weaker in a given situation. So then we brainstormed, sat down, and not going to quiz everybody on putting all this together later, but I throw this up really for one reason, and that's just to drive home the point that population dynamics of any species are complicated, and usually more complicated than than we would think when we're talking about them over lunch or a coffee. There's a lot of factors that can you know influence survival and influence reproductive output. And these factors don't often work in isolation. They often interact and sort of play off each other. So it's all pretty complicated. So we wanted to start with just sort of a conceptual uh, framework, I guess, or a conceptual a schematic of how different factors could potentially be influencing moose, and then doing that, then it sort of helps pave the way for trying to shed light on some of the important mechanisms. I should also mention that the workshop that we held, and then um, this whole exercise of trying to understand what's going on was largely driven by a minister's review that was conducted in 2019. At the request of different groups in Ontario. So this was also the motivation to do this was coming from high up as well. Anyway, we landed on 7 or 6 objectives that I show here, and most of them, and I'm not going to go through them. Bits and pieces of this we'll all go through here in a bit. Um, Most of them are aimed at understanding how different factors that might be affecting these, how they actually operate again, and what's actually driving them. And then, as you'll see in a minute, the basis for a lot of this work is involves radio collaring and monitoring very closely a very large number of moose and a very large number of other species that moose are interacting with in the landscape. So we wanted to leverage the opportunity that would be provided by having all those marked animals on the landscape and use them to help improve our surveys and our assessments, for moose. The province spends well north of $1 million every winter surveying moose from a helicopter, and even at that, we're generally behind, in surveying less frequently than folks would like, and with winters generally getting shorter, and then aircraft prices rising. There's all sorts of pressure to find better ways to be more efficient at surveying moose. So we thought that last objective, number 6, was an important one to sort of leverage some of the opportunities that we would have here. So the next step is to try and understand where would you do this, and I mentioned we're going to really try and understand mechanisms. So in one sense, hopefully anywhere that we worked in the boreal forest would provide information that's broadly useful, but we also wanted to make sure that we were sort of taking advantage of the sort of the best place. And so we landed on and again we engaged with a number of people, and we asked a bunch of questions about we actually set up a little matrix, a scoring matrix for identifying all these features that would make an ideal study area, and then we ranked different areas based on that, and we landed on WMU 13. And Wildlife Management Unit 13 is you can see Thunder Bay in the sort of south center here. Fairly large unit up in the northwest, adjacent to Lake Superior. And in the top right panel, this shows the moose population trends from about 2000, through to about 2015, that period of decline that I talked about. But then if you look at harvest, licensed hunter harvest in the bottom, you can see that around that time the population bottomed out, harvest was dropped to almost nothing. And yet, over the next almost decade, there was really only a very moderate or weak response by the population. So it really didn't respond much. So this was the kind of place that we wanted to study. There's something going on here, more than just hunting. So we centered on WMU 13. We picked a 2,700 square kilometer area around Dog Lake, about an hour north of Thunder Bay. And it's a transition between the mixed deciduous forest and the southern part of the study area and the Boreal in the north. And what was really attractive about this area is that it had substantial gradients in a bunch of things. So we knew that moose abundance wasn't uniform across this area. Um, there was on the west side of Dog Lake, there's a private forestry company called Wagner that owns some very large blocks that have very limited access. There's also the Michener Perry Township on the west where there is no hunting or trapping at all. So it's a protected area. And so there's substantial gradients in most of the factors that we thought might be exerting influence on moose numbers. And having those gradients within the study area provides a great opportunity to assess their influence. So broadly, and I mentioned this, the main focus would be to put tracking collars on moose and then have a team ready that is these collars send an alert by email and text as soon as something happens to the moose. So the instant we would get a signal indicating that a moose might have died, then we mobilize a team and go out and then try and determine not just the immediate cause of death, but try and measure all sorts of other things to really understand what led to the death of the animal. At the same time, we wanted to track the major predators of moose, which in this case would be wolves and bears. And I'll explain in more detail as we go why getting a much better understanding of wolf and bear populations and interactions with moose is important. And the same goes with alternate prey for wolves. And this again, I'm just sort of tease that for now. I'll come back to that and focus on it a bit as we get into the meat of things. We're also working with both rights-based and licensed hunters and trying to collect samples from harvested moose to get a better understanding of general health and disease status and age, the age structure of the population, things like that. And overall, we want to figure out how all these things work together to sort of drive the population dynamics of moose. So there's a lot of different players, and things like beaver and deer and these other species can have a considerable influence on something like a moose. So for moose, again, the focus, what is killing them? We wanted to learn more about their pregnancy rates. I mentioned before that the aerial surveys across the north suggested pretty low calf numbers in many surveys. One possibility is that moose just aren't having the reproductive rates are low. So we wanted to sort of rule that out fairly quickly. And then whether a moose lives or dies, we want to know where it spent most of its time. What was it feeding on? What was it doing? What are the conditions that led to the ultimate outcome, for that moose? So because we wanted to sort of establish a lot of physical measurements on the moose and to sort of determine their health status, we spent a lot of time in this is a M&R helicopter, and that's me sitting on the skid there. And basically we'd go out and find moose in the wintertime, shoot them with a drug-loaded dart, and then you fly up high. And on TV, it always drives me crazy. You see all these TV shows where somebody gets hit with a dart or somebody sticks a needle in somebody and they collapse immediately. And if that ever happens, you're going to die. In most cases, like with a moose, we hit that moose with enough drugs to kill anybody in this room, but it still takes about 10 minutes for the moose to lay down and go to sleep. And that's a long 10 minutes when you're sitting out the side of the helicopter in the cold waiting. Wait. Anyway, the moose goes down, and then when we started this, we had on the left that Sherry Cox. She's a vet from the University of Guelph. We had Sherry come up and sort of work on our handling protocol, and then that's my co-lead on the project, Joe Northrup, to the right of me, and me in the middle there. And so the moose are asleep, and we're taking a bunch of measurements and samples, sort of from head to toe. I think Joe's putting an ear tag in there. Sherry and I are doing some tick counts. It's we talk, and I'm sure everybody in this group is familiar with conducting transect surveys where you walk a line and count pellets to figure out how many deer there are, or you're trying to figure out plant density. So you walk a line and you're trying to figure out, the density of a particular plant species. On these moose, we're actually conducting transects on their bodies to figure out how many ticks they have. So we have 12 lines on their body, and we take a comb and part the hair, and then in 10 centimeter lines, we count the number of ticks and use that as an index again later to relate back to their to whatever happens to that moose in the end, or their health status. So we've got that down to about, and actually we bring an ultrasound out as well, and we're trying to assess body fat with the ultrasound, and we're still trying to, we determine whether they're pregnant based on some blood parameters, but we're should be able to do it with the ultrasound, so we're still getting the handle of that. Anyway, so you spend about a half hour. We've got oxygen on the moose, and we've got a little pulse oximeter monitoring their heart, making sure everything's fine. And then after about a half hour, we've got the samples that we need, and we reverse the drugs that we've used. And then so you're standing around the moose and you're collecting your things, and then suddenly you see like the ear starts to twitch a little bit, and it starts to get a bit frisky, and then all of a sudden they just stand up. And this cow moose, in the swamp, I'm not the tallest guest speaker you've ever had, but my head was, well below the line of the hips, when she stood up behind me. I'm always in awe at what a big, impressive animal they are. Anyway, so this is the moose just getting its bearings after it wakes up.
Hello, little miss. Please don't kick me.
She hasn't quite figured out if her feet are fast under her just yet. But then they stand there for about a minute. Sometimes they empty their bladder for what seems like forever, and then they trot off. And then sometimes they're standing there for a bit, and they're totally they must still be a little bit drugged because they don't mind that we're standing there beside them. And then all of a sudden they look at you like you just appeared out of nowhere, and they sort of flinch back and they run off as if you weren't there before and you just appeared. This one, and so we give them a combination of drugs, and one of the drugs in the combination is a bit of a chill pill. So when they do wake up, and we reverse the other ones, we leave the relaxant in them a bit so that they're a little bit calmer when they wake up. So this bull got up, we backed off a few steps, and there was a minute there where we weren't quite sure if he was gonna leave the way we wanted to, or if he was gonna come take a closer look. I'll tell you another funny thing about this moose once we watch this. This was a really cold day. You can see his breath. You can also, if you listen, you can hear the helicopter in the distance. He's coming back to pick us up, so that's what ultimately spooks the moose. So, and there's our, like I said with Steve and I, that's our shadows there. When we were processing this moose, we put an ear tag in, and we hit a vein on the left ear of that moose, and so his ear was bleeding, and we were doing all sorts of things to try and stop the bleeding. And I ended up making Steve, the guy I was with, get his extra sock out of his backpack. So I'd pressed the sock into the ear of the moose, and then it froze in place. It was so cold that day, and then we couldn't get the sock off, so the moose ran away with his sock hanging off its ear. And so later in the day, Steve followed its tracks for several hundred meters there, but he never did get his sock back. So I mentioned so the moose are collared. They go out there. They've got a GPS unit on the collars, and then the locations are sent to us, at least once a day. We get a email with a bunch of locations where the moose has been. You can have the collars take a location every hour, every half hour. Like for short periods of time, we've ramped them up to take locations every few minutes when we want to really tease out, the fine scale movements. If the collar doesn't move for 6 hours, then we get a mortality signal that indicates something may have happened. Either the collar's fallen off or the moose has likely died, and then we get a mortality alert. And as I mentioned, we try and get out there. So if it was hit by a car, if somebody shot it, or if it was killed by wolves, that's pretty obvious when you get there. In this case, this is in early autumn last year. This cow moose was really fat, one of the fatter ones that we've worked with. Everything about her appeared great, like she seemed to be in good shape, but we found her dead like this. And she just took a step over that log and then looked like she just dropped dead when she was going to walk out of the swamp. And we've collected a bunch of samples from this animal. They're still at Guelph. We still don't know what actually killed this moose. But and when we talk to other researchers, so we do I'll spare you those pictures, but we pull the hide off and then we do a complete autopsy in the field, take all the organs out, and really looking for any signs of trauma and looking for any signs of disease or parasites. A similar study in Minnesota with some colleagues that we work with, they would actually take that whole carcass to their pathology lab, and they in some cases would sling it out with a helicopter, or they would have a tracked vehicle in there, and they've had cases like this where they've got a moose that died. They're in there within 12 hours. The carcass is not disturbed in any way. They load it on, they get it into the lab, and then they have a team of vets basically pick it apart. And in some cases, they still don't know what killed it. And one possibility for this one is something called brainworm, which is a parasite that's common in white-tailed deer and not harmful to white-tailed deer, but very dangerous for moose. And in white-tailed deer, these long, thin worms, they just sort of sit in the brain cavity and the meninges, but they don't burrow in, and so they're benign in deer. But when they get in a moose, they actually can burrow either into the spine or into the brain tissue and cause neurological damage. And sometimes if everything could be fine for the moose 1 minute, and if the worm just burrows into the wrong spot and hits the wrong piece of nervous tissue, then lights out. And that's a very, very, very rare event, but can happen. And that may be what happened here. The other thing, and I talk about ultimately, like if a moose lives or dies, we want to know things about its health. So we have as you'll see in a few minutes, we have a big grid of trail cameras in the area that are taking pictures of all of the study animals on quite a frequent basis when they walk by different roads and trails. And you can see in this case, this moose has a fairly severe tick infestation, or had, and has lost a fair bit of hair. But the other thing that you'll see is if you have sharp eyes, there's a number on the side of the collar. And if I pause that, pause it quick enough. So that's moose 4. And so when we see that, we can relate that back to which collared moose it is, and then we'll have all sorts of data on it from we can add, okay, moose 4 on such and such a date in the spring, had that's probably about 25 to 30% hair loss, which is caused, as most people in the room probably know, is caused by winter tick. You can also see she's pregnant. The belly's really hanging down. So that picture was Sherry, and the moose was in winter of 2024. We just did a small number there just to sort of test our capture methods. So far, we've done over 200 moose in the study area of different section age classes. You can see here. This animal isn't dead; it's just drugged and about to be reversed. And the emphasis, the biggest sample is of adult females, and that's sort of our main focus because they're the drivers of population change. They're the ones that can birth the calves and are responsible for they have the greatest ability to dictate the population trend. But we are interested in other section age classes as well, and even with calves, I'll talk a bit more about calves in a minute. I think most mortality of calves probably occurs in their first month or two when they're really young, and that's a really hard age class to monitor for a number of reasons. But with moose in areas where they're suffering from winter tick, there can be pretty high mortality of calves about this time of year, just before their first birthday, and that's because as bad as hair loss can get from ticks on an adult moose, they're big and their surface area to volume ratio is such that most adult moose can survive even a very severe tick infestation. And a severe tick infestation might be 60,000, 65,000 ticks. So incredible numbers. But an adult moose, they'll get anemic and their condition will be impaired, but they can survive that. But a calf moose, even in its first winter, their surface area to volume ratio is different. They're smaller animals, and they can't deal with the really severe tick burden, and they can get enough ticks that they'll die they basically waste away of anemia. And in some of the New England states, losses in some years of that calf cohort about this time of year can be 50-60% of the calf crop could be lost to ticks. I don't think that's the case here for a number of reasons, but it's something that we're looking for. So we say 200 moose collared. We've had 13 mortalities of sort of non newborn calves, and 5 predation. We've had 2 hit by trucks on the highway, 1 hit by a train on the train tracks. 2 were harvested by licensed hunters, and then 9 are in that sort of fuzzy class where we've submitted a bunch of samples, and the definitive cause of death is still pending. Here's another interesting example from this winter. We got a mortality signal on this bull moose. We went out, this is about a month ago, and walked in, and we generally, when that happens up there, you expect you're going to go in and find there's a big kill site and it's had a tangle with wolves, but that wasn't the case. The moose was lying down in its bed, and no body fat at all. So that's it's a bit gross. I apologize, but that's a cross section of the femur. And that's the marrow. And in a healthy animal, that marrow in the center of the bone should be thick and waxy and not bloody at all. And as marrow including humans, in a starving mammal, marrow is the last body fat reserve to be metabolized. So when you see an animal that's substantially metabolizing their bone marrow, then that means they're in rough shape and they've gotten rid of most of their other fat stores. So this moose, when we backtracked it, it had been moving around and feeding and stuff, but just for whatever reason wasn't able to maintain its body stores and died. Interestingly, we caught this moose. So say it died in early to mid-March. We caught it in early December. And when we submitted the blood from the time we handled it, some of the blood parameters came back suggesting that it was harboring some sort of systemic infection even back in December. So this moose had an underlying health condition that it just didn't shake. And that picture with Joe and the bull previously, that was a nice big healthy bull, but it had several wounds from sparring earlier in the season, and it had a big puncture on the top of its skull and a couple in the neck and on the flank that were infected, and there was like green ooze pouring out of these. And we put some disinfectant in there and squeezed the pus out, and that was over a year ago, so a year and a half ago now. That moose made a full recovery, but if they get run down, they don't always recover from that kind of thing. So this is our 2,700 square kilometer area. The different colored lines just show the movements of individual colored moose. You'd see we ended up with, so far we've got more moose on the west side. A typical moose home range in over the course of a year, it's about 35 kilometers squared. It can be a little larger, a little smaller, depending on the landscape. But yeah, about 35 square kilometers for a moose would be the area they call home. In the wintertime, the movements really contract. If we did a road trip and all drove up to the study area now and got out, everybody would need their snowshoes. The snow is still waist deep today in this study area. So the moose are still not moving much. And their strategy, it seems to be a way to avoid predators in the wintertime. They'll find a good stand where there's good feed, and they basically stay there, and they intensively browse in a pretty small area, but they don't move very much unless you bump them. And then if they get bumped by a person or a wolf or something, they might go 2 or 3 kilometers, but then they'll stop and park again, and then they might spend the next couple of weeks inside a area that's only a few times bigger than this room even, as long as the food there will support it. So we're getting some information from the moose side of things from the collars. We also want to look at this from the wolf point of view. So we're curious about how many wolves there are in the landscape. How does that relate to mortality of moose by wolves? You know, is the number of moose that die in a given area due to wolf predation? Is that purely a function of wolf abundance, or are there other things going on? And then from the wolf point of view, we're curious what's actually driving wolf numbers on the landscape. Are moose the main currency that wolves are subsisting on, or are wolves primarily living on other things and then just sort of preying on moose on the side? So we're really trying to figure, again, the specifics out and figure out how this works back. So this wolf, sorry, I caught that in October in a padded foothold trap, and interestingly, you can see that's a very unusual color for a wolf. It's sort of light blonde, almost lab colored. About a kilometer from where we caught this guy in a trap, I was talking to some loggers, and the guy told me that a few days earlier he'd seen a cougar run across the road in that spot, and I'm pretty sure he probably just saw this wolf. There is the odd cougar in northwestern Ontario, but I don't think this was one of them. So we trap wolves in the fall using padded foothold traps. Then we put a catch pole on them and give them a hand injection, drug them. And then in the wintertime, we go out with the helicopter and we're not good enough shots to dart the moose with a dart gun, or dart the wolves, sorry, with a dart gun. But so we use it's like a shotgun approach. We use that net gun and the pilot gets us up close and then we fire a net over the wolf. And we got a few wolves just 2 weeks ago. The easy part when there's a lot of snow and they're slowed down, it's actually not that hard to get the net on the wolf, but you got to get out quick. I guess it's not a surprise that they have sharp teeth, and you put that net on a wolf, and at most you've got a minute to get on top of it and get it pinned down, or else it's got holes all through the net and it's gone across the lake again. So and when the snow, everything's happening fast, the snow is up to your waist. You can't use snowshoes. So if the pilot can't drop you off right on top of it, you're struggling through the snow and crawling, and the wolf's bounce around. And you look up and you can see that it's starting to get out of the net. And anyway, it's pretty chaotic. The good news is, like the moose, like the wolves have no interest in attacking you, and even if you're basically there poking at it with a jab stick trying to get it pinned to the ground, if it finally gets free from the net, it's going the other way. It's not coming at you. This is a shot from a few years ago from above. This is I like this picture, but I'm pretty sure that net would miss because by the time the net sort of spreads out into the wind, I think it's probably the wolf was probably a step ahead. That's what it looks like from the helicopter. And then, like I say, he circles, you get unhooked, you're scrambling to unhook your helmet and everything and get out there, and it's pretty chaotic. So I mentioned this with the wolves. We want to know, in some places where people study wolves and moose, like Isle Royal National Park, for example, it's a pretty simple system. There's wolves, there's moose, there's some beaver there, but there's really not many other players, so it's pretty neat. Here we've got all sorts of other things. So how important are moose to wolves? How important are deer? How important are human-derived subsidies? And this picture on the right, I think I have a closer up image of that, but there was one spot up in the northeast part of our study area where there was an outfitter offering some wolf hunts, and he was dumping entire cattle out. And in this picture, there's about 6 cows in this gravel pit, and actually that's a lynx. That's a living lynx in the middle of the cows, sort of saying my cows. Anyway, that's a tremendous amount of biomass for a wolf and or for a pack of wolves, and this could make the difference between wolves starving or getting through the winter. And so understanding the sort of amount of human provided food and what impact that's having on wolf numbers and things like litter sizes and pup survival is something that we're really interested in. So as mentioned, I've been here talking about wolves and coyotes before. A pack of wolves is a family, an unrelated breeding pair and their pups from sometimes from multiple previous litters. These packs are territorial, so they generally have a territory that they defend and sort of use exclusively, at least during the pup rearing season. What we found so far in this study area is that it's actually pretty messy, that most of the packs, even though they do actually have territories where they spend at least 50% plus one amount of their time, they spend a lot of time off their territory, wandering. And like that pack up in the top left that we named Slab, they were down right on the very southern edge of the study area for quite a bit of the winter because deer yard down there, and they followed deer down there. Yeah, so pretty not a clean picture at all, really. So the radio-collared moose provide one stream of evidence. If a wolf kills a moose and it happens to be radio-collared, we'll figure it out based on the mortality alert. From the wolf point of view, we can look at their predation on things that aren't collared, but by sort of following their movements and identifying areas that likely represent a feeding site. And we call those kill clusters. But basically, if you picture a wolf with a GPS collar on that's taking a location, say every hour, and it's walking around, you get dot 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 dot, and you sort of follow its tracks. If they kill a moose, they'll park on it and spend a bunch of time there until it's cleaned up. So we have filters in our data that identify these spatial clusters of locations, and we flag those as potential kill sites. We don't know what's there, but it's potentially an area where they've killed something. And then we'll get to as many of those sites as possible on the ground and try and determine what's there. And if there is a prey animal there, then we collect the usual suite of biological samples to understand its sex and age and condition and what circumstances, again, led to it being killed. So this is I'm assuming that most people are hardy to the harsh realities of nature, but here's a moose that's been opened up by wolves, a day or two old. So as of about a month ago, we've investigated about almost 300 of these potential mortality sites. 43 of them turned out to actually have remains or be kill sites. The others were basically just bed sites. So you could spend half a day snowshoeing into a spot, get there, and then there's a few wolf beds on top of a hill, on an overlook or something, and that's what created that cluster. That happens, often for the shorter clusters. But if you see a clump of locations where wolves spent 2 days or something, then you can almost guarantee there's something large there, probably a moose. We're also, I mentioned that we're interested in understanding how important moose are to wolves and how moose contribute to wolf population dynamics. So to contextualize that, we're collecting wolf scats. And in addition to the other data streams, this is important because, again, we want to know, are moose sort of the primary prey? Are wolves really linked to them, or are they just a secondary prey, that wolves are feeding on sometimes, whereas they're generally eating deer or beaver or something else. So we're getting at that through scat analysis. Some prey items are obvious when you clean and boil a scat, you boil them to kill any parasites, then you flush all the yucky stuff out of there in a sieve, and then you sift through the hair and identify what type of animal that came from. With some prey species, it's pretty obvious, but when it isn't, hairs are sort of like fingerprints. Hairs of different animal species have unique scale patterns on them, and by looking at the scale patterns and comparing it to reference samples, you can usually, even for a hair that looks a little bit ambiguous when you just look at it with the naked eye, by looking at the scales, you can determine what species it came from. So I mentioned this already, that we're interested in the role that these sort of food add-ons might have, and it's not just livestock like this being dumped, but we've had wolves spend weeks parked behind a taxidermy shop, and you don't even think about that. But here, somebody's busy in December and January, like processing all these deer heads, and they're putting all the deer heads on the back 40, and it's a tremendous amount of biomass, and wolves will spend weeks there just feeding on that. Various other sort of subtle things that if you're just driving by, you wouldn't think about it. But when you look at where wolves go, or if it's in southern Ontario, you look at where coyotes go. They tell you where everybody's dirty secrets are and where all the stuff is on the landscape. Another interesting thing. So I mentioned wolf packs, are territorial. They have these territories, several hundred square kilometers, but there's a segment of the wolf population that are not territorial and transient animals that just wander around and you know we assume that most of those transient animals are looking for a territory of their own somewhere, looking for a mate or a place to breed. But some animals just seem to like to roam and to stay solitary for years. We've had wolves from the Thunder Bay study area go all the way up into two communities in the far north, so Fort Hope and Agoki Station, and not only go up there, but go up there and come back. We had one go down past Hornpain, many hundred kilometers. We've had one of our wolves is almost in Duluth, Minnesota right now, gone down through the states. Um, we've had wolves from partner studies in Minnesota come up into our area in Thunder Bay. We've had our wolves go up into the far north. I'm involved in another study of wolves and caribou and moose up in the far north. We've had some of those wolves come down towards Thunder Bay. When you connect it all together, you've basically got one big mixing population of wolves all the way from Minnesota up to the Hudson Bay coast. And so there's really no, if we were to to draw some lines around a management unit or something and say, oh, this is this unit for wolves and that unit, it doesn't mean anything to the wolves. They're super mobile and they can move, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers and they're basically, there's very little evidence for any population structuring in the Northwest amongst the wolves. It's one big panmictic population. So I mentioned we're interested in deer. We're interested in deer as a food subsidy and a prey source for wolves, but we're also interested in these shared parasites. So I mentioned that case with brainworm. So we've been radio collaring some deer. We most of the deer we put these. It's almost like a giant raccoon trap or a cage, a heavy but we put these are called clover traps. It's got nothing to do with clover, but it's the person that invented these. I think that was his name. So we wire the door open. We start baiting these traps. We put trail cameras on them that are cell phone enabled. Once we see that the deer are going in and out of the traps freely, then we go and set them. And usually the first night you'll get a deer or two in the trap. You go out. If you're the bigger of the people that go out, then your job is to someone else will lift the door up. You've got to run in the trap and grab the deer and hog tie it and pin it to the ground. And we put a blindfold on, put a collar on and an ear tag, and then take them out and let them go. And anyway, we had a bunch of new technicians on the project this winter, and they were all excited to try their hand at deer trapping. And to a person, they all got schooled. So, and deer seem to have an influence in the study area, but they're really only found in the southwestern part, in the wintertime anyway, in the southwestern part of the study area. This is a tiny sliver south of Dog Lake, and you can see the one deer in the summertime went up sort of further north into the study area, but for the most part, in the winter, deer are only found in the southwest corner. And yet we have wolf packs, entire packs of wolves from 2 or 3 territories away, making these big movements and coming down to park in the deer yard and feed on deer. And they might spend weeks there before they go back north to their territory. So we're curious about that because on one hand, all that time those wolves are spending in the deer yard, that's time that they're not spent chasing moose. So that's a positive for the moose. But then on the other hand, they're surviving and they're feeding and getting fat potentially in the deer yard, and they're gonna go back and have healthy litters of pups. So what's the net balance there? Are they? And it's the same with the supplementary food. You could argue that if we put lots of cow carcasses out and the wolves feed on them, then they're not killing wild prey, and that's true in the short term. But what's the larger picture? Are you actually creating a elevated wolf population? And I think and I'm a poor storyteller here. I'm going to cut to one of the chases. Adult survival is pretty high of the moose, but the calf survival is really low, and predation on calves seems to be a pretty big deal. So you could have wolf populations that are surviving on other things or being propped up by other things most of the year, not really having much to do with moose for much of the year, but then come summer when they're back on territory and they're raising pups of their own, then they exert a heavy pressure on calves. So I think these other things like deer and beaver on the territories and human-derived food subsidies, all those things are probably important players in this system. So it's starting to sound repetitive. I mentioned this beaver are important because they're a food item for wolves. So we've done some surveys and tried to sort of estimate the density of beavers across the study area. And our goal here really is just for each wolf territory, each pack in the study area, we want to know how many beavers do they have available in their territories. And again, how does that relate to what they're doing with moose or not doing with moose? And I mentioned this at the start too. We've got all these marked moose out there. So this winter, we had people come out and do the standard methods that the province applies for when they're counting moose. We had them do a survey like that across our study area. We participated in it. And then after, we're able to look at our data from our radiocolored moose, and we can see, okay, on this plot, you counted 7 moose. You only saw 1 moose that had a collar, but we know from the movement data that there was actually 3 collared moose on that plot. So that enables us to figure out what the citability is during the survey, which is something that has previously been an unknown. The assumption is that people doing the surveys are seeing most of the moose, but we don't really know that. And so this provides an opportunity to actually put some numbers to that and not just come up with a number of what percentage of moose you're actually seeing, but to actually come up with a model that says, depending on the habitat type and the light conditions and the snow conditions, this is what percentage of moose you're likely seeing. So we did a more intensive survey across the area, estimated about in the neighborhood of about 500 moose in this 2,700 square kilometer area. So we've probably, we're getting close to about 40% of the moose being collared in the area, and probably more on the west side of the lake. Like the northeast corner of the study areas, there's not much, there aren't many openings or clear cuts, so it's pretty hard in the winter to find the moose and dart them in that area. So we've got a big network of trail cameras across the study area, and we're using those to look at the seasonal distribution of these different players in the system, and also to record things like pack size, the number of animals in the different packs, and how that changes throughout the year. And on these trail cameras, we get as you'd expect, a variety of different species. This was an interesting video. It has nothing to do with the study, but it was just a cute moment from one of the trail cameras. So I think it's the mother feeding in the background. The 2 kits are either she's not letting them feed or they're already full and they just want to play. A lot of lynx in the study area, and more in 2025 than this year, but we would commonly see them when we're out just doing other things. You'd run into lynx. So mostly I've talked about about wolves and their potential interactions with moose, but black bears could be another important predator of moose calves. So we want to get some more information on that. So as a start, we set up a bunch of these barbed wire hair stations across the study area. And then, as you'll see here, we collect DNA from specific bears from these little barbed wire hair corrals. We use that DNA to genetically fingerprint and identify individual bears. And then based on the number of unique individual bears and how often they're recaptured, we can actually come up with estimates of the total number of bears in the study area. So we had a bunch of these corrals set up. We collected about 1,600 hair samples. Here it says genetic analysis ongoing, but we actually got our results back. And we estimate about 350 bears in the 2,700 square kilometer study area. I ripped you off, though. I didn't show you this, just to show you how these hair corrals work. And I should have zoomed in into full screen, but there's for those of you that are sitting close enough, there's a really nice big chunk of hair on this barb. So lots of DNA, and the bear still has both testicles. So we're collecting bear scats throughout the study area and doing the same type of analyses. It's interesting with bears. There's almost as many bears in the study area as there are moose, just a little bit less. So for bears to have an impact as a predator on calves, they don't have to be very prolific at killing calves. If half the bears in the study area killed a single calf every year, that would actually be a substantial number of calves. So we don't know how many bears prey on calves or how many calves bears prey on, but those are things that we want to get at. And that's a big difference between bears and wolves. There's a few differences as predators. Wolves can prey on moose year round. Bears very rarely. We did work on moose calves in southern region here in Algonquin Park and in Parry Sound District. And for the most part, when a moose calf is about 50 days old, they're pretty safe from bears, but they're not safe from wolves really, ever really. So wolves are more efficient at preying on moose, but wolves are a lot more rare on the landscape than bears. So bears might be a significant predator just because they're common. Wolves could be a significant predator because they're better able to prey on moose of all age classes. So low recruitment, we see that during our winter surveys. So calf survival is important. I mentioned just now that we did a study of moose calf survival and mortality factors of moose in Algonquin Park and in Wildlife Management Unit 49 west of the park, 15 years ago now, actually closer to 20 years, I'm getting old. And there, the mothers, the cows were extremely defensive. If you went in to radio collar the calf, it was really hard to move the cow off the calf long enough to get the collar on. And the second you got that collar on the calf and got her there, they were back together. In northeastern Minnesota, and also in this study area, maybe because predation is higher, but the cows they seem to be less invested in the young calves. So we're not able to radio collar calves in this area because there's too great a risk that the cows will abandon the calf and not come back. So we can't do that. So we're having to do a few other. It's still an important piece of the puzzle. So we're relying on a few other methods to assess calf losses, and I'll get into those here. This is something new since the last time I would have spoke to you. We're now using radio collars on both the wolves and the bears and the moose that have video cameras built in, and so you're actually getting a view from that animal of a snapshot into their daily life. So the top right picture, that's a camera on a wolf, and you can see there's a very unhappy moose with its ears laid back, standing off. The middle frame, that's from a wolf as well. You've got a wolf feeding on a dead moose, and then on the bottom, that's a wolf with a camera looking at the wolf in front of it as they're walking across a lake. So here's a camera. This is a video from a camera collar on a moose. You can hear it chewing. But I guess the main point here is, in addition to seeing what the moose is eating, you can see what the moose sees. So that's the main thing we want. As a side benefit, we'll be able to use these because we have a precise GPS location with each of these videos, we can use them to ground truth habitat maps. It's like, oh, the map says this is a mixed conifer stand. What's the video say? And then you can look at it, or even conceivably you could even count the amount of browse in the view shed of the moose. But for the purposes of the study and the things we've been talking about so far, another view from the moose is interactions with wolves. So in this case, we've got an injured moose with a camera collar, and it's in a river, and there's wolves on the bank here, and it's not too gory. There's a wolf just shook. And yeah, it's clear on my screen, unfortunately, that it is on the big screen. So this moose is injured. It's in the river. It's actually in some of the clips on this clip on some of the frames, you can see that it's already bleeding from the neck. There's blood coming down in front of the camera, and eventually this didn't go well for the moose. There's clips where the camera's underwater and there's water flying everywhere and splashing and yeah. And in the end, this is what happened to the moose. And when we went in to investigate and discovered the dead moose, we put a trail camera off to the side and got a video of this collared wolf, and then another wolf comes out in the background feeding on the remains of the moose. You can hear a chickadee singing in the background. Doing this kind of work, you have to be sort of impartial and just sort of take it as you see it, but it's hard not to be disturbed by the death that we see. And I found that especially like when we're investigating young animals, and what kills a calf moose or what kills a fawn deer or something, and it always in this clip, you've got a dead moose that was alive in the previous video. It's solemn, but then in the background you've got chickadees singing and other sort of signs of life, and it's always a strange paradox. You're walking out of the woods from having investigated something like this, and there's birds and squirrels running around as if it's just any other day and nothing's happened, and yet for this moose it's lost its life, and for these wolves they're gonna carry on for a while because they've got food. So here's another one. No blood. So that wolf's alone, and it's reaching out to its pack mates. I won't go through all these in gory detail, but here wolves are feeding on a moose. So again, there's locations that go with this, so we can go back with our movement data. Is this one that we already cataloged, or did we miss this? What happened to it? So it provides another piece of evidence there. So I mentioned the different data streams. So we're not able to collar calves. So we're hoping that these collars with the cameras on them, both on the cow moose and on the wolves, will provide that insight into what's going on with wolf predation on calves, or if it's or bears, because some of the bears are going to have collars with cameras, and then the cow moose will be able to see whatever it is that's harassing the calves. But here's an interesting thing that gets to a whole other area of the study. So this wolf is filming its pack mate. So this wolf with a camera, there's another collared wolf over there that doesn't have a camera. It's looking at that wolf. There's a cow moose and a calf out in the pond. The cow's coming into view there with her calf. She's not happy. Her ears are down. It's actually a collared cow, so we know her movements. In the next clip, the other wolf jumps out into the pond, actually grabs that calf, takes it right underwater. The cow moose proceeds to put a beat down on the wolf, and then the wolves retreat and the cow and calf leave, and that calf survived, and they walked away from this, and which is, we never would have guessed that would happen. You would think that you've got two wolves 20 feet from a newborn moose calf here. You would think there's no other scenario here other than that calf dying, but that's not what happened. And there's another one here, and when you're looking at these clips, you have to you can only take a few, and then you get motion sick. Yeah, the wolves aren't winning any Oscars for their cinematography. So we've got two older calves here. You can see they're a little bigger than that previous one. They're starting to be a bit mobile. as far as we can tell, there was never actually attack here. So this wolf with the camera is right there in their face. It's looking at them at close range. It circles them. The cow stands her ground. She's got her ears back. She's making some noise, and the wolf retreats. So we're really interested from a research point of view, going back to understanding drivers. What's the difference between cases where there's a successful attack from the wolf's point of view and an animal dies, and cases where the moose are able to avoid being predated and stand off? Is what are the factors that contribute to that? And so we're hoping that we can observe these things enough times and measure enough of the habitat or other features that are going on around it to actually understand what conditions are more likely to lead to one outcome versus the other. And that's the kind of understanding I think that we need to actually try and influence predator-prey dynamics, through sort of indirect management of habitat or other things that might affect wolves. Yeah, not much else on that one. The next clip is sort of interesting. So those wolves that had the moose in the beaver pond and didn't get the young calf, later that same day, this is the clip of the same wolves later in the day, and you can see they're chewing on some old bleached out bones that have no flesh on them at all. So they were unsuccessful with those calves, and they moved back to an old kill from earlier in the winter, and they ended their day in defeat, chewing on some old bones. So I put this in as a placeholder because I'm talking about different data streams and sort of technologies. So I mentioned this, that we're really interested in non-lethal encounters. So whether you're an adult moose or a calf moose and you have a close encounter with wolves or with a bear and you survive, that's what we're really interested in, and we want to learn more about that. So the collars have proximity sensors in them. So if a collared moose and a collared wolf, say, that don't have video cameras in them, or if something happens and we don't catch video of it, if they come within a certain distance of each other, the collars actually log a proximity event. And then when we get the collars back, we have a record of all the times. So if a moose dies 3 or 4 years into the study, we can download that proximity data and say, oh, the moose ended up dying, in 2028, but 6 times over the previous 3 or 4 years, it had close encounters, with these wolves. And then not only do we know when they happened, but we'll know where they happened and who was involved. And again, it provides all these additional bits of context, which is really important. So we're almost done here. So I mentioned bears, and we've done the things with bear population assessment so far. We're going to put collars on with cameras on bears this spring, if spring ever arrives up there. Here's just a different, and this doesn't directly relate to the study, but it's another interesting scenario that you would never really understand this story or never learn about this story if you didn't have these different bits of data. So one of the wolves, so the wolves have mortality switches on their radio collars as well. So last winter in 2025, I think it was in, say, February 22nd, something like that, we get a mortality signal on this wolf collar. And we notice that the location, the wolf is off its normal territory. It's not in its home territory. It's actually about 10 kilometers northwest of where it usually spends its time. So we go into the ground and we find the dead wolf here. And there had been some fresh snow, but under that snow is blood and hair. And it looks like another pack of wolves has come and found this wolf trespassing and killed it. And that does happen. So this wolf had a camera collar on it. So later on, the winter was busy. We're doing a bunch of other things in the field. So I didn't actually look at all the videos on this camera, I think, until end of April or early May. I'm looking at it and I see this curious video from about 24 hours before the wolf died. And there's a bit of blood in the snow and it's digging. See, you can see a little crystal, you can see some blood. But then there's this odd den. There's a den there for sure. And like, what is that? And so we figured out, but there's clearly a den. So we figured out where this was, and then it was a big trek to get in there. So we get into that spot, around May 2nd, we find this. And I think it's a bear den, but I'm not 100% sure. So now I'm thinking, well, this is weird. The wolf seems like it went into a bear den. You can see some blood there. It abruptly moved, 15, 20 kilometers to the northwest of this spot. And then it seems to have run into another pack of wolves and died. This is all pretty strange. So we put a trail camera basically at the same view that we're looking at here. We put a trail camera looking at this den. And also at that spot, when we went into May, we found a dead pup. So here's a wolf pup that's emaciated and dead, and it was curled up in its bed close to the den. So it further adds to the mystery of what went on here. What's this wolf doing dead at this strange den? Anyway, we were in there, I think around May 2nd or 3rd, 3 or 4 days after we were in there, this bear emerged from the den, and you can see its face is scarred up and its ears are bitten. So that wolf was in the den, fighting with this bear. The bear survived, and it's got both eyes. And I think this is a video. Scarred up, but the scars are healed. Checking out the camera, as they do. This next one, you can get a better look of a couple things. Now the bear's really checking out the camera. Now it's scratching its back. But there, if you look, so it's fairly skinny cub in the back. So not only did the bear survive, but it was able to defend its cub. But look at that ear. That's pretty much a perfect impression of the mandible of a wolf. It bit that ear out and then the other one, and so quite a tussle there. And on the video camera from the wolf, it's just chaos and darkness, and you don't really know what's happening. But here, and then to further add to the scenario, when we took that wolf, and then months later we finally autopsied it at Trent, and when we opened up its stomach, it had a big thing of rope in its stomach that was like, again, a lanyard, and which was basically taking up a lot of the potential stomach volume. So it was a big adult male wolf, but it had this rope in its stomach, so it really couldn't fill its belly very well because of this rope. So it was probably always hungry. It wasn't in very good shape. That pack was an anomaly that winter. Like they killed far fewer moose than any of the other packs in the area. And, I think a lot of it probably has to do with that rope and just that the wolf wasn't very strong. And then that, being hungry like that all the time and not being very efficient as a predator probably led to this normally it would be risky for wolves to go into a bear den, but they're very hungry. So it went into this den, had a tussle, and then must have got injured. The wolf must have been injured when it went in there with the bear, and then ran off. And then as it's running away, it runs into a neighboring pack and ends up getting killed. So a very interesting last few days for that wolf. Anyway, that's pretty random and doesn't have much to do with the other stuff, but it's just an example of tying together different bits of evidence to try and tell a bit clearer story about what's going on out there. So this is where we're at. We're in 2026. We've got another year. We'll probably start to get some preliminary results, and then if there is any sort of adaptive management work to come from this, it'll probably be in the 2028, 2030 range. In the meantime, we're going to continue to try and keep our sample sizes up of all these different animals. Keep the camera work going. We're doing a bunch of all the scat sampling on the ground. We've got a sort of a small army running around doing stuff year round pretty much on the program. And I acknowledge some of the main team members here. I'm sure, as I usually do, I probably kept you longer than I should have, but I appreciate your attention, and happy to stick around for a few questions. And if you want to learn more about the project, we actually have a sort of a general inquiry email, or you can reach out to Joe and I, or Joe or I. But yeah, thanks very much.
You've had some movements that have been killed by cars or vehicles. Is that, are you using any of that information as a prey or a predator?
Oh yeah, I mean, if anything, so the question was, or the observation was that we've had some moose, maybe a surprising number. There's three so far have been killed by vehicles, two by trucks, and one by train. Yeah, no, we're very interested in the importance of that as a mortality factor compared to the other. There's been three moose in the study killed by vehicles, only two by hunters. So far. And the study area, when I go back to the map um, of the study area, which I will here. Oh, you sure? It's okay. Delicate cable here. The eastern boundary, both the eastern and western boundaries of the study areas are actually highways. So that's the Armstrong Highway on the east side that goes up to Armstrong Highway 527. And then that's the Trans-Canada on the western boundary, that goes up to Ignace and on through to Manitoba. So there's a fair bit of traffic on both of those roads, and yeah. So over the course of the study, if more moose are killed, what we might be able to identify, and then based on the movement data of moose that successfully cross the road, the collared moose, we can identify spots that are safe crossings, and then areas that don't seem to be so safe, and maybe there'll be a recommendation around fencing or additional signage, something like that. I don't think with the train, there's a lot more train traffic up in that part of the province than we have down here, and I don't think there's much that's going to be done about that. And there's no way that the train can. We've talked to the conductor, and they say they fairly commonly hit moose, and they blare the horn and do things, and sometimes the moose just either can't or don't get off the tracks, and if that happens, they can't do anything about it. Yeah, we'll start at the front and work. We'll start at the front and work back. Yeah, so the winter tick, not really. They seem to be most problematic for moose. The deer, white-tailed deer, do get them sometimes, but you rarely see much hair loss from the winter tick. So no, the moose seem to be, and the same with like other ungulates like elk, caribou. Both can get them, but it's pretty rare to see any serious hair loss in anything other than a moose. Yep. It's the wrong area of the brain or so the brainworm. Yep. Yeah, I was told that before. So the question was about brainworm and how does it sort of negatively affect the moose? And so again, it's a long, thin worm, gets in in deer, it stays in the meninges, the brain, like and doesn't actually penetrate, so it's fine. But in moose, they can burrow through either like the spine or in the brain, and they can depending on what part of the nervous tissue they burrow into, it might be benign or it might cause serious problems, and it often messes with the optic nerves, so they go blind sometimes, and then people see this behavior where they lose their fear of people and they start to circle. So you asked about seizures. I don't know that it causes seizures per se, but it certainly has a host of other ailments. And interestingly, a low-level infection with brainworm, it's possible that a moose can actually develop antibodies and actually kill the worm and escape. So it's not always a one-way trip. It's not always fatal. And we're particularly interested in that. But if it gets bad enough, and the intensity of infection is probably related. So deer are involved in the cycle. Deer, as I mentioned, aren't harmed by the parasite, but they shed the larvae in their feces, and then the larvae go into a snail, and the snails crawl up on the vegetation, and then moose ingest the snails. And a moose, when they're feeding, they're not very discriminating, and in a given day in the summer, a moose might eat 15, 20, 25 snails, and so it's easy to see how they get infected. Okay, yep. Okay.
Second question, these collars and so on that the word hammer collars, how does that impact the ability and the habits of its
Yep.
And how would the wolf have injected people?
Yeah. So three questions there. See if I can remember them. what does recruitment mean was the first question. And yeah, recruitment, it's actually a loaded question. We could talk quite a while about it, but in the sense we're using it in, recruitment is so if you have a calf, if you're a moose and you have offspring, at what point are those offspring contributing to the broader population? That's when they're recruited into the adult population. So it's a different, the age at recruitment is different for different species. Like for a moose, because they don't breed until, most moose don't breed until their second year, you could argue that they're not technically recruited until they're 2 years old, but for survey purposes, we consider them recruited if they're still alive, at the end of their first winter. So that's recruitment. The second question was about collars, and so I think there are guidelines for different species for maximum collar weights, and we take those and then we back off a little more even. So if we're allowed to have a collar that weighs 4% of an animal's body weight, then I'll back it off and say 2% or 2.5. But I would also say no animal, I'm sure, enjoys having a collar. The only case where the collars might actually be beneficial to the animal is sometimes with wolves, they get into a snare, a lethal neck snare, and the snare goes around the collar and actually saves their life. But they probably don't know that. So it's more, and for moose are so big that by the animal care guidelines, we could put a much larger collar on the moose if we chose to. We don't, because they're so big. People ride moose or use them as pack animals. So I don't think the collars have much influence on the moose. On animals like a lynx, there you want to be very careful because they need to get close to the prey and they need to run very fast and get to them. So something like a lynx or a wolf or a coyote, yeah, we try and be much more conservative, I guess, in terms of the weight of the collar. And but again, it's unlikely that it's helping them run faster. If you're a wolf, so there probably is a cost. What we're hoping is that the cost is very small relative to, to the other information gains. The other thing I should add is that the collars have release mechanisms on them, and those have generally been pretty bad. Like they're not unreliable. They're getting much better, luckily. And now the release mechanisms on these collars, they the collar can actually talk to the release. So we can look at when the moose collars send locations, they also send diagnostics. So we get an alert that says, oh, your batteries are starting to go. So if we see the batteries are starting to fail prematurely, we can actually I could do it right now, and the rest of the people in the study would kill me for wrecking it. But we could release some collars from the computer here, and it would send a signal to the collar, which would send a signal to the release mechanism, and it would go off. So then you can go in and we've had to do that a few times this winter where a collar is either failed prematurely or something's happened, and we've had to go in and release that ahead of schedule and then get in and recover it. I think I'm forgetting number three though. Oh, yeah, the rope. I have no idea. The only thing I can think about that rope is if it was attached somehow to a bait or but it really looked like the rope was a bundle. So I don't know, or maybe I'm wondering if was the rope in the back of like somebody's sled on the skidoo, and was it soaked in blood? Like was it a trapper sled or something, and was it saturated with blood or something else, and then flew out on a skidoo trail? I really don't know, but it was a big bundle of rope that no idea how it got there, but it was there. Yeah, I'll keep moving back. Yeah. I think you're probably right. They are more concentrated there, but I think the effect isn't as strong as it looks because access for us was better on the west side. So it was easier to sample there. Like that whole area in the northeast section, east of that eastern arm of Dog Lake, there's very little road access or very few clear cuts there. So it was hard to find the moose to dart them. And so we always go out and we focus on those areas that are hard to work with. And then we spend some time there, and then we get frustrated and go where it's easy. Yeah. Yeah.
ticks.
Yeah.
Moving north, you say in southern Ontario, moving in, are they also moving north into this type of territory, or is that long-standing reality?
Yeah, so the question about ticks. So I think ticks are a long-standing issue, winter tick for moose. It is changing though, like they're starting to become a factor further north than they previously would have been. So that's true. But I think yeah, no, it's something that's been there for some time. The interesting thing with ticks is that having a moose population that's depressed for any number of reasons is actually helping them escape pressure from the ticks because tick infestations seem to be density dependent. So the ticks are the most detrimental in areas where moose are the thickest. And so some of the New England states that they don't have wolves, and because of access, there's not a tremendous amount of hunting. So they have black bears as a single predator, very little hunting, no wolves. And they have our moose abundance in this study area is about 0.2, 0.25 moose per square kilometer. There's other areas in New Hampshire or Maine where there might be 2 to 3 moose per square kilometer. And at those abundances, the prevalence of ticks is much, much, much higher. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good. So the question was, would I consider wolves a keystone species in that area? And um, yeah, I guess it's another loaded one in terms of how you define keystone. So if we think of a keystone species as something that one animal that its health status can be indicative of the health of the general ecosystem or of animals at other trophic levels, then probably. But it's it would be hard to look at a healthy wolf population and know instantly what other features of the ecosystem are booming. All you could say is that there things are good, there's good food and so on. You wouldn't really know what it was, I guess. So it's sort of a partial indicator. Yeah, it would be easier, like I mentioned, some other systems where there are fewer prey species and maybe fewer predators. And those simpler systems, a healthy predator population would always be indicative of healthy prey conditions. Yeah. Oh, I'm just moving back. We'll come back to the front. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So the question, one, how did we pick the study area? And two, are forest fires a factor? Um, yeah, so we had I think I mentioned briefly, but we had a basically like almost a matrix setup where had a bunch of features that we were looking for in a good study area. So we wanted a moose population that was depressed. We wanted a moose population where hunting had been reduced, but the population hadn't responded. We needed it to be close enough to a major center that we could get helicopters. We needed to be able to establish a fuel camp or a field camp, sorry, and fuel caches. And then we wanted gradients. Like we wanted a study area where we had deer in part of the area, but not everywhere, where we had different abundances of bears, for example, in different parts of the area. So all these things sort of we actually scored all these criteria, gave awarded a few points, and then this area seemed to be a clear winner on most of those accounts. Yeah, and then sorry, the second question again. Oh, forest fires. Yeah, so I think in this study area, we're far enough south that forest fires aren't a big deal. Like they're controlled fairly quickly. Um, I mentioned earlier, we also have a study going on in the far north and in the Mississauga and Oziski caribou ranges in the far north, and there fire has a major influence. And one of our radio-collared wolves from up around Big Trout Lake in the far north last winter ended up in Thompson, Manitoba. And as it was moving west last spring and into the summer, it was you could look at the fire maps and see how it was getting deflected by fires. And in some cases, it would have to backtrack 7 or 10 days, to get around a large fire and around. But it was consistently going west northwest. But sometimes it had to really move, like to get around these fires. And then it ended up the fires around Thompson basically stopped its progress, and it ended up establishing a territory there. Yeah, we didn't see that last year. So we had we put collars on about 30 wolves in the far north in the winter of 2025, and none of them came south in 2025. We had a couple come south in this year, but yeah, but something interesting to watch for. Yeah, and I mean, that's another topic for another day, but I was up there in February and was amazed at the size of some of those burns. There's burns there that are 40, 50 kilometers long, and it's just crazy. Yeah. Yeah, John?
Foxes, one of their prime food sources are little rodents like mice and moles, that sort of thing. Is that not the case with wolves as well? And are those little rodents there in any quantity? And do they provide a food source for the wolves? Like, depending on the season, whether they're accessible in the winter.
So that's interesting. So the question was, smaller carnivores like foxes and even coyotes can do pretty well on a currency of voles and lemmings and things. I don't doubt that wolves eat them sometimes, and we see evidence that they do, but generally, because of their body mass, we consider wolves to be an obligate predator of something big. So we call them obligate predators of ungulates usually, and it's just because of their size. If they had to live, even if a wolf was feeding on snowshoe hares, they would have to, an average adult male wolf would have to kill probably 3 hares a day, every day, day in, day out. And even at that, they may struggle a bit. So that's just too much of a burden. And with small mammals, like, I think Farley Mowat documented that in the north. And I think, I don't doubt what he observed, but I think what he observed was a sort of a short-term phenomena during a boom in lemmings. And I'm sure those wolves were eating bigger things at other times of the year. And I actually, and it was getting late, but years ago, I was given a talk in southeastern Ontario, and this question came up, and I mentioned that, and I talked about, how Farley Mowat said that in Never Cry Wolf, and I saw somebody sort of flinch in the audience, and it turns out it was Farley Mowat. And it was quite a surprise. Anyway, it was fine. Yeah. Yeah.
They have what their miscarriage or abortion rate is. Are they losing? I'm wondering about the drop in the calf population. Is it happening, before or during birth?
Yeah, that's so a good question about calves and gestation. And you remind me that I skipped that slide. So we took blood from all the cows at the time of collaring and had it tested for pregnancy. And what we found is that pregnancy rates are really high. And then when we did go in and try and do some work in the early years with the calves, and we found that twinning rates were also very high. So twinning rates and pregnancy rates are very high in the system, but calf survival is very low. So we get a blood sample when the first year that we handle the cow, so we can determine her status. Then in subsequent years, like this winter, for example, all the cows that were collared last year, we had to go in the wintertime and follow them in the snow, pick up their poop when they pooped, and then we can do fecal progesterone and determine pregnancy from their pellets. So it's another big chunk of work, but we're curious every year to know, what the pregnancy status is of the cows. Yeah. Yep.
I think there was like one mortality map. There's this like a horseshoe of deaths. Is there a reason for that?
Was that a mortality map? The map of all the yeah. Well, those are all the sites. So that horseshoe was all the potential kill sites that we visited. So what that was a sort of a popular travel corridor from the pack. Many of those dots ended up just being places where they rested and not killed. But that pack though in that area was pretty prolific. And I didn't mention this explicitly. I sort of hinted at it, but there are real differences, even within this study area and any other study area where we've looked at this kind of thing. Like some packs are quite good at killing moose, and then others are really not, and they might even be neighbors, And so we have one pack in the southeast part of the study area that they were up in the teens for moose kills last winter, And we had other packs, not that far away that might have killed 2 or 3 moose, the entire winter. So very pronounced differences there. Yeah.
Um, so, it took me and my friend out fly around and say, if you don't see 10 moose, you don't play. But apparently in that area, in the Matlock area, 50 years ago, there were lots of mines.
Yeah. So, well, Mattawa is north of Algonquin and Wildlife Management Unit 48. Or maybe we're thinking of a different Mattawa. Are you thinking of Meteshawan? Meteshawan? Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where when I think of Mattawa, I think of on the Ottawa River. So I'm thinking of somewhere different. Yeah. But well, it's north of the park. There is a healthy moose population there still. Yeah. Yeah. I think it not always been. I think it suffered in the early 2000s as well, but in recent years the moose population there is pretty healthy. Yep.
Well, on behalf of the field naturalists, I'm really thrilled with the type of presentation that you gave us. It was so distinct. It was so interactive with us. It also shows us how everything is totally connected.
Yeah.
Yes, and if people step in, that's when things seem to go wrong sometimes. But thank you very much for coming and talking to us. It was an excellent presentation, and I hope you come back.
Well, thank you. Just like that. Well, thank you. Yeah, that would be the one take-home message that nothing is, it's very rare for something to be as simple as it first appears.